With a steady supply of weapons and ammunition from the West, Ukraine has been able to mount a formidable defense against Russia through the past year of conflict. How sustainable is the military supply chain to Ukraine? Will countries like Poland increase their support to Ukraine and growing pressure from the U.S., their prominent ally? In this dialogue special for Ukraine crisis 1 year on, we have William Courtney, adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Corporation and former U.S. ambassador to Georgia and Kazakhstan, and also Andrew Korybko, Moscow-based American political analyst. Well, welcome to the discussion, Ambassador. We know that you used to work in Georgia, Kazakhstan, countries part of former Soviet Union. Well, let's take a look at the confrontation ongoing right now. There's a fear that there might be the use of nuclear weapons at a certain point in the future. Say senior officials from Russia have talked about that for a couple of times. And how realistic is it, for that kind of scenario?
It's probably not so realistic, but you are correct that Russian leaders have talked about this. In 2018, in a major address to the Federal Assembly, President Putin showed a nuclear missile flying around the world and landing in Florida. So this kind of nuclear rhetoric, nuclear intimidation, if you will, has really been absent since the collapse of the Soviet Union. But President Putin and his leadership cohort have brought this back. In Ukraine, using a nuclear weapon probably would not give the Russians much of a military advantage, but it would certainly bring stronger international condemnation on Russia.
But here we have is the situation of, on the one side, Russia, for example, they have nuclear weapons, the largest nuclear warheads. On the other side, Ukraine, they were not a nuclear power anymore. But will, say, the NATO countries, including the US, the UK, France, they are nuclear powers. Will they step in if there's this kind of worst scenario of the use of nuclear weapons?
Well, it's hard to predict what might happen in a hypothetical future scenario. But what we are seeing is that at the beginning of this war, the Western countries and the United States were more reluctant to be too much involved with supporting Ukraine, because they were concerned about nuclear risks. So, for example, the United States denied a request from Poland to transfer MiG-29s to the U.S., which would then transfer them on to Ukraine. In the nearly years since that time, the Western allies have become more confident about what might be red line for Russia. Now, no one knows for sure what decisions the Kremlin would make, but it's clear with a very large conventional military effort that Russia is mounting, that the Kremlin does not seem to see nuclear weapons as a silver bullet to win the war.
Mm-hmm. If you look at the reality, Ukraine's manpower is limited. Many of its cities are destroyed, and its economy is now in shambles, basically. So is it fair to say that Ukraine's war effort is almost entirely dependent on the provisions of aid from Europe and the United States? And then the question is how sustainable is that kind of supply?
Well, that military aid has been increasing every month since the war began, and it's still increasing. New kinds of weapons are being provided now, even this month. This new small diameter bomb rocket system that the U.S. is providing has a range twice that of the HIMARS rocket artillery system, which the U.S. provided before. So it's pretty clear that the West is not diminishing its support. It's continuing to increase its support for Ukraine. One cannot predict the future, but what we can see is that the Ukrainians are fighting very successfully. They're using Western military equipment successfully, and there's a lot of patriotic fervor in Ukraine to defend their country. So while its population is smaller than Russia's, there has been no shortage of recruits to fight, and the Ukrainian troops are being better trained than the Russian troops. So this gives them some advantage, a qualitative advantage over the Russian forces, which have larger numbers now after the partial mobilization in Russia. But the Ukrainians are still doing well.
Well, that's true. Obviously, the Ukrainians have proven to be more resistant, I guess, than the Russian expected at the beginning. So Ukraine is aiming at victory against Russia. But then, of course, people have this question, what does a victory mean for Ukraine? Does that mean the recovery of the territories currently under the Russian stronghold in the east? Could it also include, for example, Crimea or the retake of Crimea? What do you make of it? About the Ukrainian goal of victory?
The Ukrainian leadership and people have made very clear that their goal is to regain all of Ukraine, including Crimea. At the beginning of the war, the West is a little less certain whether recovering Crimea had the same importance as recovering the rest of the country. But now I think the West is fully behind the goals that the Ukrainian leadership and Ukrainian people have set forth to recover the entire territory. And indeed, if Russia were to still control Crimea, that would be a threat to shipping from Odessa and other ports in the Black Sea and the Azov Sea. So I think now people understand that Russian control of Crimea would be destabilizing.
Some people, when they talk about the end game, they would say, obviously, they either say, the key is in the hands of President Joe Biden, as long as he made a phone call to Kyiv, and then there will be a ceasefire, if not a peace deal. And the other people would say, well, the ultimate, solution is in the hands of Putin, as long as he withdraws his forces, and then there will be no war. What do you make of it?
There is zero chance that President Biden or President Macron or Prime Minister of Great Britain or the Chancellor of Germany are going to tell Ukraine that it has to negotiate a deal with Russia, which would leave Russian forces occupying Ukrainian land. That's not going to happen. Russia really has to make a decision whether it's going to continue to try to fight this war or end the war. It was Russia, remember, which began the war, not Ukraine or the West. So Russia will have to make that decision. And Russia's current circumstances are continuing to decline. What the Russians call the correlation of forces is continuing to move against Russia. So Russia really needs to make a decision to salvage what it can before Russia continues to decline further.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ambassador, are you concerned with this? People are talking about maybe, ultimately there will be some fatigue among the public in European countries, or even with the government, or in the U.S. If there's a change of government in 2024, a Republican president, or the American public could be, they say, tired of the continuous supply of weapons to Ukraine, but the Ukraine is relying heavily on the supply from European countries and the U.S. If that's the case, we see the war may be unsustainable for the Ukrainian side.
We do not see signs of fatigue yet that are important. We do see in the United States some liberal progressives and some conservative, more isolationist folks expressing skepticism about how much and how long the U.S. is going to support Ukraine. But overall, in the Congress, there's very strong bipartisan support and continues to be, and we see that in Europe as well. If we look back in history, we don't see fatigue being a major issue when the cause is just. So, for example, in Europe, after World War II, when the Soviets kept so many divisions of soldiers in Eastern Europe, the West began responding by increasing its own forces and continued that until the Cold War ended. So fatigue is maybe an issue that is not really going to be so important in a circumstance in which the cause is clearly just.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ambassador, if you look at the current situation, we see, with the supply of tanks and probably longer range of missiles or even fighter jets to the Ukrainian side, there's talk of the spring offensive from the Ukrainian side, and now from Russia, there's mobilization. People say probably we are already in the new offensive from Russia. So escalation for the near future, and still no sight of the ceasefire for the war?
It's not clear how these offensives are going to develop. For example, Russian forces still seem to be conducting probing attacks against the Ukrainians, but have not launched an all-out offensive. It appears that Russian forces are not yet prepared to carry out that. With regard to Ukraine, Ukraine is fighting defensive actions at the moment, but has promised that it will launch counteroffensives, and that will require combined arms operations, infantry, armor, artillery, aviation working together. It appears that Ukraine is going to be more prepared in the future to conduct those kinds of combined arms operations. So we can expect that Ukraine will, in fact, mount counteroffensives to retake more of its territory.
Mm-hmm. Well, Ambassador, if you look at the issue beyond the Russia-Ukraine conflicts, how do you see the importance or significance of such ongoing conflicts, the impact on the global, on the international community, or in particular, in the sense of geopolitical competition between different great powers?
Well, it is certainly clear that the Ukraine conflict now has become an existential issue in European security. That the security of Europe since World War II, which has relied on countries not attacking each other to gain territory, that Europeans are willing to fight to maintain the integrity of that European security order. That's why we see Europeans providing so much assistance to Ukraine, both military and economic, and so much public support in Europe for the war, and the same in the United States. I don't think, though, that this conflict is going to have a global impact that's going to be, tremendous, if you will. So, for example, while the U.S. and China have some tensions, they are also cooperating in many areas, and that cooperation is not likely to be reduced as a result of the war in Ukraine. So I think the global impacts are going to be more limited, but the regional impacts will be more important.
Well, that's all we have for the talk. Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show, Andrew. I know you are based in Moscow. In your observation, we know that the conflict or the special military operation has been going on for 1 year. Of course, there are biting sanctions from Western countries on Russia. So how are things going in Russia?
Okay, I'd say that a lot has changed, but at the same time, not a lot has changed either. So this sounds a bit paradoxical, of course, so I'll briefly explain. On the one hand, what has changed is obviously the exodus of Western companies. You no longer see Western brands, products. A lot of Western services have discontinued operations in Russia. So you do have that. And for those folks that were using those products or services, it's been very inconvenient for them. But nevertheless, such products and services have found non-Western replacements, whether Russian or non-Western ones from the global south. At the same time, though, because of the sanctions, there was a bit of a fluctuation in the currency during the first month or two, but because of the Russian government's financial response to these unprecedented sanctions, the currency has ultimately stabilized and has been performing pretty well over the past 12 months. So in terms of what hasn't changed, I'd say, is that in spite of the currency fluctuation during the early onset of the special operation, everything in that respect has more or less stabilized. Although there is inflation in Russia, that's all across the world nowadays and isn't directly attributable to the special operation, but is nonetheless observable. And in terms of just society in general, things are normal. I mean, honestly, if I wasn't following the special operation on the news, you don't really see much of it. I mean, you do see lately, over the past couple months, some posters here and there in public transport promoting different servicemen that have participated in the operation. But apart from that, if you're not following the media, you're not really seeing it. So it's been a bit paradoxical, but more or less, I'd say pretty stable, pretty decent.
Well, obviously, there will be some impact, or there is impact on global order, or I would say the Russian foreign policy, partly because, for example, the European partners, they are basically cutting off economic and trade ties with Russia, and Russia is pivoting, so-called, to Asia. And Asian countries, India, China, and other Asian countries, Africa, etc. So we are seeing changes because of the conflict.
Yeah, so what we have seen is that there was this forced decoupling between Russia and the EU brought about by American pressure upon that bloc. And as a result, Russia has been forced to prioritize its relations with non-Western countries in the global south. First and foremost among them, China, India, Turkey, Iran, and a panoply of African states as well. And we've also seen the Russian foreign minister paying quite a few visits to Africa, more so than he has ever done in any time in recent memory, perhaps even ever. So what we're seeing here on the foreign policy front is that Russia is focusing on non-Western countries. It was already doing that prior to the special operation, but nowadays it has completely accelerated this trend. This is having very serious implications for the emerging multipolar world order because it is accelerating that process. With there being no bridges left between Russia and the EU, this has pretty much led to an unprecedented situation in Western-Eastern relations, whereby Russia is serving as an engine of these multipolar processes, whereas the EU is being forced to serve as a brake because of the U.S.'s power over that bloc. So we see a lot of East-West tensions. I mean, of course, Russian-European relations are practically non-existent at this point, not just on the economic front, but also political as well, whereas Russia has comprehensively diversified its relations with those non-Western countries, principally in Asia, but also in Africa, and of course there have been some inroads in Latin America as well. So this is how I'd summarize the changing world order over the past 12 months with respect to Russian foreign policy.
Well, we still remember, I think, is the U.S. officials saying that, the goal of the Ukraine conflict is to weaken Russia. Based on what you have said, probably we say the U.S. is not achieving that purpose right now.
Yes, I would agree with the conclusion that the U.S.'s stated goal of weakening Russia has failed. And this isn't just my own opinion, but also the New York Times recently ran an article that pretty much declared that the West's anti-Russian sanctions have failed. They cited their own experts as well as IMF forecasts about the Russian economy to argue that the Russian economy is no longer contracting, but is actually poised to show some very, very moderate growth across the coming year. And what that goes to show is that Russia has successfully diversified from its previous disproportionate dependence on trade and investment with the European Union through its policy of reaching out to the global south. Once again, China, India, Iran, Turkey, and a collection of African countries first and foremost. And we also can't forget the Gulf kingdoms as well. Altogether, we can see that on the military front too, the U.S. has also failed to weaken Russia. And we know this because we can recall many of the hysterical reports over the past 12 months warning that Russia was running low on manpower, ammunition, missiles, and whatnot. But, I mean, Russia's special military operation still continues to this day. So those forecasts, we can say in hindsight, were either wishful thinking, fake news, or a combination of both. My conclusion is that they were a combination of both. If we look at it on the political sense, this campaign has failed to destabilize Russia. There is no realistic chance of a so-called color revolution breaking out inside of Russia. So it's also failed in that way. However, if we look at how the special operation has boomeranged, I mean, we see that the European countries have actually been the ones most adversely affected by it. Their economic growth has been impacted. There is a noticeable uptick of socio-political unrest brought about because of their declining economic conditions, and there is some uncertainty about which way they're going to go in what is now, in my personal opinion, an indisputable NATO-Russian proxy war being fought in Ukraine. So I find these to be some pretty interesting conclusions that the U.S. might not have expected, but Russia itself seemed to have been prepared for, given how it's responded thus far.
Recently, Russia has said that Joe Biden, the president of the U.S., holds the key to ending the conflict. Probably if he likes, he can make a phone call to Kiev and call off all the operations there. So do you think so? And why the U.S. is not doing that?
Yes, I do believe that President Biden personally holds the key to bringing about, at the very least, a ceasefire in this Ukrainian conflict. The reason being is that Zelensky's former senior advisor, Alexei Arestovich, had admitted at the end of March last year, so we're talking about 11 months ago, that his country's military-industrial complex had pretty much been destroyed by that point. In the months since, or rather in the almost calendar year now since, Ukraine has received approximately $120 billion, with the B, dollars worth of military, financial, and other forms of aid from the NATO countries. This being the case, we can conclude that the only reason that Kiev is able to continue fighting is because it is completely dependent on external support. If that external support were to come with strings attached, ergo, for example, stipulating that tangible progress be made on at least seriously negotiating a ceasefire in the conflict, then I do believe we would have seen a lot more progress on that front. It's also important to recall in this context what former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett had recently revealed during an extended interview. He said that he was carrying out diplomacy on behalf of the U.S. and the West and trying to achieve early on in this latest phase of the conflict some type of ceasefire or even a more lasting resolution. But it was his impression, he said, that the United States did not want that to happen. And his impression, mind you, he is the Israeli leader, and Israel is very close to the United States, but also, surprisingly for some observers, Russia as well, is that Russian reports at the time and to this day maintain that Boris Johnson had visited Kiev around that time, whether or not it was at the U.S.'s behest or perhaps independently, to try to scuttle that process. What we do know is, speculation aside, the previous progress that was being made on the peace process at the time had suddenly ended, okay? So I think that if we put everything together, what former Prime Minister Bennett has said, Russian reports from other sources, and our own observation, we can conclude that if the U.S. was serious about making progress on the peace process, that it could definitely happen. And it would happen by putting stipulations on the amount of military aid to Kiev by making it dependent on tangible progress being made in the peace process. Why I believe this hasn't happened is several factors. In brief, on the one side, you do have the whole soft power aspect. This has become a political crusade of sorts for the West. It has become integral for unifying the transatlantic bloc. Therefore, any type of compromise solution could be seen as going against the absolute ultimate goal that the West has tried to portray this conflict as being, ergo, in their sense, trying to break Russia, balkanize Russia, and whatnot. And also the fact that you have certain interest groups. You have the anti-Russian faction of the U.S.'s permanent military, intelligence, and diplomatic bureaucracy. You also have the arms lobbies in the military-industrial complex. So you have a confluence of factors that have thus far contributed to the U.S. indefinitely perpetuating what I and many observers conclude is a proxy war between Russia and NATO at this point.
Well, a proxy war between Russia and NATO, and I remember, one of the NATO senior officials said that, NATO is prepared for a military confrontation with Russia. And of course, German foreign minister made it public, like we are at war with Russia. So obviously, the Ukraine conflict is having a serious impact in terms of relationship between Russia and the West.
Yes, it absolutely is. In fact, if we go back and we think about what happened in the lead up to Russia's special operation, we shouldn't forget that Russia really did its best to avert this course of events. Namely, Russia had offered a bunch of security guarantee requests for resolving the creeping security dilemma between itself and NATO over missile defense and other types of military strategic aspects of pertinence to its national security. However, unfortunately, the U.S. and NATO completely rejected Russia's security proposal proposals outright. From Russia's perspective, it felt compelled to resort to military means to defend what its leadership regards as their national security red lines in Ukraine. By doing so, they were basically forced into setting the sequence of events into motion, but we shouldn't forget that, as I said, they were forced into this situation. Because they were forced into the situation, everything spiraled to the point where we're at. But I do believe that the United States itself wasn't so sure that Russia would resort to military means, let alone to the scope, scale, and extent that they have thus far. What I mean by this is I think that the United States felt that Russia would capitulate and unilaterally concede on its national security interests in Ukraine, brought about through NATO's clandestine expansion in that former Soviet republic, to allow the U.S. to gradually blackmail Russia into a series of unilateral concessions and so on and so forth. But I think that at the same time, we need to remember they were warning about a type of Russian military reaction, but they seem to have believed it would be concentrated in the Donbas region. However, we see that there was a lot larger area of operations than that. Why I believe the U.S. was somewhat caught off guard by this is that both American media and officials have warned about a military-industrial crisis, meaning that the U.S. cannot sustain the scope, scale, and pace of armed support to Kiev. Had the U.S. seriously predicted that Russia would react this way, which caught it off guard, despite them forcing it to in hindsight, they would have retooled their military-industrial complex to produce the arms that Kiev is used to operating, namely Soviet-era arms that the former Warsaw Pact countries still had factories that they could have continued producing. So I think what happened was
a good point,
a confluence of events that neither side really predicted.
Andrew, what's, from Russia's perspective, what is the end game?
The end game, as it has evolved right now, I believe, is to reach some type of understanding where the existing line of control is frozen. Okay, Russia seems to have sent out some feelers and hints and indicators that they'd be interested in that type of outcome right now, compared to the maximalist goals that they initially declared at the onset of the special operation regarding Ukraine's denazification and demilitarization and constitutional neutrality. I think that the reason why Russia seems to have climbed down a bit, unofficially of course, but from reports and observations, is because, like I mentioned in my last answer, neither side expected each of their counterparts to react the way they did. Just like the U.S. didn't expect Russia to have a large-scale special operation, neither do I believe that Russia expected the scope, scale, and pace of NATO's armed assistance to Kiev. This has led to a situation where, after the reunification of former Ukrainian regions with Russia, which Kiev and the West views as an annexation, but as I said, Russia views as a reunification carried out through a referendum, that seems to have changed the facts on the ground. And with Foreign Minister Lavrov declaring that any type of agreement must begin by acknowledging the facts on the ground, that seems to indicate a type of willingness for Russia to compromise. However, because this has not been reciprocated by the West, meaning the U.S., NATO, European countries, and especially not Kiev, which is disproportionately influenced by its Western patrons, I think that we can expect offensives by both sides. By both sides, I mean Russia and the NATO-backed but Ukrainian-fronted fighting force, as Russia describes it, that they're fighting against in that neighboring country. I believe that after these two reported offensives that everybody believes is being planned, by everybody I mean media reports from all sides, after the smoke settles, we're not sure when it will be. There are too many uncertainties. Then I do believe we might actually see some more progress towards some type of ceasefire at the very least. But until then, I'm very pessimistic, and I believe things will get a lot worse before they get better, unfortunately, because of this dilemma that we have, which I do believe is brought about by the U.S.'s refusal to encourage Kiev to seriously consider some type of compromise negotiation, at the very least, a temporary ceasefire.
Right, we have to end there. Andrew, thank you very much for joining us and your insight. Hopefully we will have you again in the future on our show.